O is a morally educated person. The understanding about dimensions of morality can be facilitated if we reflect a bit on whom we call a morally educated person. While analyzing the meaning of education in the previous unit, we saw that moral consciousness is a sine qua non of being educated. Second, in our discussion on the connotation of moral education, we distinguished it from moral instruction and moral training. On the basis of this, we can hold that we would not like to call a person morally educated, who has had a kind of moral upbringing, which is about what to believe instead of why to believe. What Kohlberg called a bag of virtues approach to moral upbringing does not make a person morally educated. According to this approach, morality consists in certain fixed and unchangeable values which are to be instilled in children via rewards and punishments. Children so brought up are only exposed to character training rather than moral education. Moral education in the true sense involves many other aspects. First, a person who is not capable of reaching her autonomous moral decisions, or reaches them without giving proper consideration to the particular situation, i.e. the context, may not be described as a morally educated person. We must understand that our moral action is invariably situation dependent and not to indiscriminately follow certain course of action in accordance with the virtues we have been taught. If a doctor, for example, speaks the truth to that patient that she is suffering from some difficult to cure disease, his action will not be a moral action. Secondly, regarding positive characterization of a morally educated person, we can say that such a person should possess adequate factual knowledge relevant to the context. Ayer, 1946, calls this aspect, non-moral, fact of the case. The relevance of such awareness is not that one can logically deduce the ultimate decisions from the factual premises, but rather it enables one to size up the situation and understand the likely socio-moral consequences of acting on certain alternative course of action. If the teacher tells a student that she is having a low intelligence quotient, or the doctor tells a patient that the disease he suffers from is fatal, in most cases the consequences of such truthfulness may be disastrous. Concealing the truth in such cases is far more morally good than telling the truth. Apart from the knowledge of non-moral facts of the case, for executing the moral choices one should possess certain skills, especially the social skills. One must, for example, need to understand how to relate to people, get on with them, and even communicate with them. Hence, a morally educated person needs to possess knowledge and understanding of the feelings of others. Such understanding and feelings pertain to the affective domain of one's personality. Therefore, an emotional approach, directed towards the interests, rights and feelings of others, rather than only cognitive approach, may be required. Sometimes our moral behavior is affected by our own feelings and emotions more than by a consideration of others. When we come to implement the decision taken at the cognitive level, we are pulled by many forces that Aristotle called the pleasures, which may deter us from doing what we ought to do, or what our rationality impels us to do. For example, my friend is hospitalized. In such a situation, my duty is to go to the hospital to see him. But for some feelings, I don't like to go there but spend time taking rest. In moral context, such conflicts between reason and emotions have always remained. Emotions like attachment, greed, and selfishness are a direct antithesis of morally good behavior. We will discuss such conflicts in detail in the later units of this course. At this juncture, it is sufficient to indicate, as St. Peter once remarked, rather confessed that, the evil that I would not, that I do, and the good I would, I do not. In Downey and Kelly, 1982, there are in fact two kinds of feelings and emotions given to us by nature. One, those that lead to self-preservation like the ones indicated in the above paragraph, and the other, those lead to social preservation like sympathy, empathy, love, kindness, caring for others and the like. In our mature moral development, we need to strike a balance between the two kinds of emotions. Nevertheless, there is no denying the fact that emotions play a significant role in moral development of man. They are not to be considered as merely an unpleasant remainder of human infirmity. It must be seen as playing an essential role in the development of morality. As we know, computers cannot act morally, for they lack the ability to respond emotionally. It is, in fact, the emotional aspect that makes us humane and enables us to live as moral beings. Difference between morality and ethics. Morals, or in other words, moral values, are generally associated with personal view of values. Personal morals tend to reflect beliefs relating to sex, drinking, gambling, etc. They can reflect the influence of religion, culture, family, and friends. Ethics, on the other hand, is concerned with how a moral person should behave. Ethical values are beliefs concerning what are morally right and proper, as opposed to what is simply correct or effective, i.e., an individual may personally believe that drinking is immoral. However, drinking is not, in and of itself, unethical. Further, it is unethical to impose your personal moral values on another. Ethical values transcend cultural, religious, or ethnic differences. Ethical values embrace a more universal world view. Trustworthiness, respect, responsibility, fairness, caring, and citizenship are some important ethical values. Ethics and morals seem to appear similar on the face of it, but if one analyzes deeply, there is a subtle difference. It means, it may be ethical for someone to consume meat, and at the same time the same person may find the idea of slaughtering an animal repugnant. This implies that ethics define the code that a society or group of people adhere to, while morality delves into the right and wrong at a much deeper level, both personal and spiritual. For instance, hunting wild animals like the deer and tigers in India was ethical till the other day, because there was no law against it. But the recent legislation has banned it, making it illegal. Following ethics is thus a relatively simple affair, but morals are, however, relatively difficult to adhere to. Morals define personal character, while ethics stress a social system in which those morals are applied. Different facets of morality. Morality, as we have indicated above, is a multi-dimensional and multifaceted concept. There are many issues and concerns involved in this concept. A better and more comprehensive understanding of the different facets involved can be obtained through the following example. Hirsch A.Al. 1979, reveal three distinct dimensions or facets of morality by quoting the story of Slotin. Slotin was a nuclear physicist who was experimenting upon the development of atomic bomb. The experiment required assembling pieces of plutonium. In the experiment, he was gently pushing one piece towards another in order to ensure that the total mass would not be large enough to make a chain reaction. The screwdriver with which he was pushing the pieces slipped, and consequently, the pieces of plutonium came too close together. Unfortunately, the chain reaction started filling the room. There were 7 co-workers watching the chain reaction on their instruments. Instantly, without losing a fraction of a second, Slotin moved and pulled the pieces of plutonium apart with his bare hands. This act, he knew well, was virtually an act of suicide, for it exposed him to the largest dose of radioactivity. Immediately after the incident, Slotin calmly asked his co-workers to mark their precise positions at the time of accident in order that the degree of exposure of each of them to radioactivity could be determined. Having done this and calling for the doctors, Slotin apologized to his colleagues and said what later turned out to be exactly true: he would die and they will survive. An analysis of Slotin's tale displays heroic proportion of morality. Slotin performed the most courageous and moral act of separating the pieces of plutonium with his bare hands. Slightest delay in his action could have caused immense loss of life and property. It was his uncompromising sense that people matter. He showed an unconditional concern for saving human, individual life and welfare at the cost of his own life. In addition to the great concern for human life, he displayed a sharp ability to judge, to size up the situation impartially and accurately, and also the courage to act accordingly. Slotin's tale suggests that morality consists of a unique combination of caring, objective judging and resolute action. Devoid of any of these aspects, the total behavior would have resulted in an entirely different state of affairs. On the basis of this tale, one can say that morality is neither a good motive, nor right reason, nor resolute action. It is all the three: caring, judging and acting combined. A brief description of each of these dimensions is attempted in the following sections. Caring. Caring implies reaching out to help others. It also involves a kind of social or psychological understanding. To feel for another is to think of him, her and understand his, her needs as well. Love thy neighbor as thyself expresses the essential meaning of caring. Carol Gilligan, a famous American psychologist, is a strong proponent of care orientation to morality. She upholds the ideal of attention and response to need of others. This perspective involves how to act responsively to protect or help others in need. According to her, certain conditions in the early childhood, especially in relation with the mother, has causal effect on the origin of this way of judging and experiencing the self. Care is a typically female phenomenon, whereas justice is typically a male phenomenon. That is, some exceptions apart, male are normally more justice-oriented whereas female are more care-oriented. Care does not only differ from justice in content, but also stands for a different form of judgment. The fact is that thinking in terms of care does not conform to a necessary condition that Kohlberg lays down for the form of moral behavior, universalizability. As we discussed in the earlier unit, for any behavior to be moral, it must be universalizable. One can understand this in the following manner. If you pass a certain judgment in a certain situation, you must accept the same judgment in every situation that is the same in relevant aspects. Kohlberg, 1983p. 71-72. In brief, universalizability amounts to the impartial application of norms, rules and standards. But in the case of care, the perception of uniqueness of people, situations and relationships takes a central position. Care perspective has a focus on particularity and not universalizability. It is, therefore, a particularistic form of judgment, whereas justice perspective lays emphasis on universal application. Judging, in the context of Slotin's tale as cited above, has a different connotation than judging the adequacy or appropriateness of a moral decision. As is clear from our discussion of caring orientation, especially as given by Gilligan and her associates, Slotin's tale is a typical example of caring dimension. Here judging simply means sizing up the situation and doing the needful instantaneously. It is unreflective reaching out to help others or to avoid the situation from deteriorating. Judging in the care perspective means judging the needs of other people. Yet, in another sense, judging is distinct from caring. We often reason through or judge a moral problem, in which welfare of others is at stake. We tend to seek answer to questions of moral obligations, questions which asks us what our duty is in relation to others. In such situations we engage ourselves in the process of thinking rationally. For example, should I support my party man in election, even though I know for certain that he is corrupt or incapable for a public office? In the case where we find ourselves involved in moral dilemmas, we need to deliberate and make distinctions between different shades of good. In addition, there are certain controversial socio-moral problems where taking moral judgment becomes more complex and requires a more reflective and considered thought. For example, there are controversial moral issues like euthanasia, mercy killing, abortion, etc. Often the general consensus in such cases is that it is morally bad to take another's life. But would it be bad to kill a person in self-defense or in a situation where the safety and security of the nation is at stake? Moral and value judgments imply reasons, not simply rules like, killing is bad. Moral judgments also deal with questions of moral obligations and question of moral values. We make judgment of moral obligation when we say that certain action is morally right or wrong or ought to be done or ought not to be done in a given situation. When we speak about duty or rightness or wrongness of our acts, we are talking about how we should act towards others. But when we make judgments about certain people, motives or traits of character as opposed to judgments about actions or practices, we are expressing about what is good or bad, worthy or unworthy about people. Examples of judgments about moral values are: revenge is an ignoble motive, self-fulfillment is the only legitimate goal of education. Statements about moral values are claims about what the good life consists of, what is fundamentally worthwhile and what should be pursued, cherished and passed on to the next generation. Morality and justice. Kohlberg, 1964, made a significant contribution in complementing and expanding Piaget's ideas on moral development. Piaget, in developing his theory of morality, drew upon famous sociologist Durkheim and great German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Durkheim held that we are moral beings insofar we are social beings. Morality as a concept is meaningful only in the context of society. Considering the distinction between Kant's heteronomy and autonomy of the will, Piaget, 1932, talks of two kinds of morality: conventional morality and rational morality. When our conduct is dependent on the approval of others, it is guided by heteronomy of the will, or it is called conventional morality. We refrain from an undesirable conduct because of fear of disapproval of others, or for fear of being found out. But when the individual reaches a stage of the autonomy of the will, their behavior is directed by their own rational moral choices. This morality is called rational morality. Piaget, in fact, wanted to explore the nature of children's moral judgments. To achieve this, he worked in three areas: I, their attitude to rules; E, the judgment of right and wrong; and E, their assessment of justice and fairness. Through his longitudinal and cross-sectional studies, Piaget found that moral development of the individual is a progression from heteronomy of the will to autonomy of the will, from conventional morality to rational morality. In conventional morality, children tend to follow obedience to adults' commands and uncritical adherence to rules. But when children are able to formulate or accept the rules after critical reflection, they may be said to have reached rational morality. Like Piaget, Kohlberg also stresses that moral development is a cognitive process and is based on moral judgment. Moral judgment further depends on reasoning children make. In the final analysis, Kohlbergian ethics is the ethics of justice. Good action is that which is just or fair. From the point of view of justice, moral problems are regarded as conflicts between claims, especially between rights and duties of individuals. Judging in terms of rules, standards or principles is compatible with the justice approach to morality. The norms, property, life, contract, promise, how norms are related to these may be explained, can be interpreted as realms of values which gives rise to imposition of concrete rules. Principles represent procedures that enable a person to judge rationally in situations to which different norms imply or in which uncertainty exists about the appropriateness of certain rules. Acting. Perhaps the most important thing that can be said about action, is that it is not moral or immoral in and by itself. Outside a person's motives or judgments, her actions have no moral worth. Slotin's separating the plutonium pieces apart was not immoral as such. What made it most moral was the quality of caring and judging, the motive or the intention associated with the act of separating. Killing, for example, when done in self-defense or of the invader, is not morally wrong, but the same act, killing, done with an evil motive becomes murder and makes the person criminally culpable. Yet, there are some behavior, which we as teachers do promote, and others which we condemn. For example, when children hit one another, abuse each other, deliberately miss classes, refuse to share their materials, etc., we do not appreciate. But when a student volunteers some work like caring for the elderly people, help the disabled, we appreciate such behaviors. Psychologists have suggested that certain kinds of behaviors in children, such as waiting for their turn, helping people in need, sharing goods, etc., need to be reinforced even before the children can fully find out rational justifications for such behaviors. The most plausible reason for condemning certain kinds of behaviors and appreciating some other kinds is that children, by nature, are naive and unsophisticated. Their behaviors are directed by corresponding feelings, emotions or intentions. They behave without concealing any emotion or intention, for they have not yet developed capacity for expediency. So the teacher punishes or does not appreciate a child for hitting another child and appreciates another for helping his classmates, with the faith that the child has a corresponding feeling. Children's actions are always infused with certain kinds of feelings or emotions. If X feels bad about Y, she may abuse or refuse to share things with him, her. If some student, A, refuses to help another student, B, it may be because B might not have helped A. There are always reasons for the ways children behave. So indiscriminately condemning a child for certain kind of acts which we consider as bad is not desirable. We must reflect and find out the reason and then remedy the situation. We must take cognizance of the total situation and not the particular act that a child performs. In fact, children's behaviors are not based on wider generalizations, for they have not yet developed any such capacity. And hence, when a particular behavior is appreciated, it is appreciated along with the feeling that the child had in that situation. Similarly, when a specific behavior is condemned, it is done along with the corresponding feeling, which was associated with that behavior. Obviously, in the early stages of child development, the teacher's job is to appreciate and reinforce habits like cooperation, telling the truth, honesty, helping others, etc. With the development of their power to reason, the children will come to know the logic behind it. So, they must be introduced to democratic way of life through such simple habit formation. Even though action is not a moral category per se, yet without opportunities for action and reflection on action, it is difficult for moral development to take place. While teachers must be careful not to equate social conformity with morality, it may be that a firm grounding in social conventions provides an indispensable preparation on the route to moral autonomy.